pages in the previous. The main thing for today is global security. You know, in the very beginning of this semester, you remember the four structures, right, as defined by Susan Strange, the famous scholar who passed away. She provided four structures of IP, right? Trade, finance, and security, and technology and knowledge structure. These four structures. So we just follow these four structures, right? So after approaches, right, we studied trade structure, then finance, monetary and finance structure. Although there were two chapters, international debt and financial crisis chapter added, right? So trade structure, monetary finance structure, then today the security structure. So this is, you know, where we are going, and these, you know, different topics. It's not new to many of you. I mean, especially those who took IR. You know, IR textbook has these chapters, right? Trade chapter and finance, security. They appear in the same IR textbook. But the difference here, I think today's goal is to link how trade structure and monetary finance structure, including debt and financial crisis, how these two previous structures, trade and finance, money, connected to the security structure. That's the goal of today's class, right? We are not just, you know, dealing with security as a separate issue, right? The ultimate goal is to, there were financial crises, global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Then have they, anyway, I mean, do they have anything to do with U.S. security policy, U.S. security objective, U.S. monetary policy? Do they have anything to do with U.S. security policy? That's the goal of today's class. And if you read this chapter, yes, there are linkages, right? Deeply connected. Financial crisis, U.S. security policy, they are linked. The security structure, let me finish up some of the remaining pages in the international debt and crisis chapter. It was okay. I mean, we went over all these, you know, basics of why that occurs, why particularly poor countries suffer from debt, right? And different kinds of financial crises over time. But at the end, let me direct your attention to final several pages. We were talking about sort of the structural deficiencies of the United States in the 80s and 90s, right? The U.S. economy was having a lot of structural problems in the 1980s and in the 1990s, right? That led to, you know, financial crisis, U.S. financial crisis in 2008, right? So you remember that, like the structural problems facing the United States. Then the section on bubble burst. So these are structural previous conditions, right? Then these structural conditions, deficiencies, resulted in the U.S. financial crisis, the U.S. bubble, right? So you need to, we haven't covered this in much, you know, detail, like the real estate bubble in the United States, and, you know, a lot of, you know, banking crisis in the United States. So you go ahead and read this, okay? how the U.S. bubble popped up, 2008. Go ahead and read it. That's on pages 224 to 225. Okay? How the U.S. bubble popped up. So you go ahead and read it. I haven't summarized it in PowerPoint, so you go ahead and read it. Then the next thing, 226. This is important, 226. So once we know how that bubble in the United States bursted, then next step is then how different schools of IPE, okay, different IP schools, how do they diagnose the US financial crisis and the global financial crisis differently? That's on page 226, 227, right? So this is important. How different IP schools look at the crisis differently. So here, OEL school, HIL school. OEL school is extreme, right? Extreme liberal school. HIL school is like a Keynesian type of structural school, right? So how do they view the US and global financial crisis differently? You go ahead and read it, right? This is kind of a pages where the approaches we learn, okay, in the beginning of this semester, structural view approaches and liberal approaches, Marxian approaches. These pages apply these different approaches to the global financial crisis. So on the final exam, I'm thinking of giving essay questions based on these. How different IP approaches look at the global financial crisis differently. Right? Now, the next thing, so different schools, different IP schools, that's important. Next thing is, then how did we go about resolving the financial crisis? That's the next step, right? So number one, G20. G20 was formed after the global financial crisis. What is G20? G7 was meaningless, right? So G20 was reconvened, replacing G7, right? On the agenda, topping the agenda was global financial crisis. Right? How do we clean up the mess, financial mess? What was discussed in G20 meetings? Right? Was it successful or failing? Right? So G20 is important here. That runs all the way to 220. I think 220. Oh no, 234. 234. Okay. The final section discusses global governance, global financial governance. Right? To get around to prohibit the recurrence of these kinds of financial crises, what should be done? New global financial governance is needed, right? And second, IMF must be reformed, right? What mistakes IMF made, that's discussed in these pages, right? So global governance, and at the center of global governance, IMF is there. Okay, so please read carefully these pages. Then let's then discuss the security structure. The security structure is not squarely, I think, like a fit into the IPE discipline, sub-discipline, because security, is actually one of the general IR and security studies like a subject rather than IPE. But here, the main thing is how security objectives, right, interlinked with real IP issues. That's what's important, right? So we need to understand then how, initial 2 pages, it raises very interesting questions regarding global security facing us today, right? Then global security undergoing some, transformation. Security issues before the, during the Cold War, after the Cold War, by nature, security issues look quite different, right? They're how different? I think that the dividing line was, the Soviet collapse, right? Soviet collapse broke up the Cold War security structure. Then the post-Cold War, right? So the main thing is to make a distinguish between this Cold War security structure and the post-Cold War security structure. And to give you some defining characteristics, I think that I have, PowerPoint summary here before we get into PowerPoint summaries. I think the Cold War security structure, what most distinguishing characteristic of the Cold War security structure, like a traditional security issue was most important, right? Traditional security issue, which is military weapons related issue, right? So countries like killing each other's citizens, right? That's traditional security issue, right? Mobilizing weapons, accumulating, weapons, aircraft, missiles, right? That's part of the traditional security structure, traditional security issues. Now, the Soviet collapse broke up these foundations of the Cold War security structure. Then the new world is open now, right? In the post-Cold War security structure, we have very different situation, very different security agenda here. There are several, but number one, the way the post-Cold War structure, security structure, different from the Cold War structure. Number one, non-traditional security issues. Number one, non-traditional security issues. What are non-traditional security issues? Summarily, it's called NTS, non-traditional security issues. Then what are non-traditional security issues? Like non-military security issues. Economic security, number one. Economic security. In other words, on this issue, economic security, particularly in the developing countries, they are so poor, right? So these poverty, economic development issues lead to, wars. That's economic security. Human security, energy security, climate change, or struggles for food security, right? We are more and more deficient of food, right? Many countries. So food security, right? And how about terrorism? Right? Terrorism is kind of a threat that we have never imagined in the traditional security structure. So today, it's not clear who is the real enemy. The traditional security structure enemy was very clear and present, the Soviet Union, communism, right? But today, Russia no longer enemy, although Russia sometimes raising their head, right? But Russia no longer is the enemy. China is ambiguous, right? So the globe as a whole, we are defining who are the enemy, who are the threats, right? So maybe terrorists are replacing the formerly communist threat, right? So terrorism. And wars are occurring more for internal reasons today in the post-Cold War structure. More internal wars, right? Rather than intra-state wars. So these intra-state wars, like internal wars, called differently civil wars, right? Civil wars, a more common type of wars in the post-Cold War security structure. Civil wars, right? And this textbook is right. The post-Cold War security structure is more unstable than the Cold War structure. More unstable. And more violence. And this chapter asks, then why more violence after the Cold War? Why more violence? So Cold War structure was relatively, I think, peaceful, right? So the big question, what explains violence after the Cold War, post-Cold War? Right? Does it have anything to do with globalization? More violence, civil war, right? These non-traditional threats, terrorism, does it have anything to do with globalization? Or financial trade issues, development issues? That's IPE, like a kind of approaches. And geopolitics more important in the post-Cold War security structure. Geopolitics more important. What is geopolitics? Yes, I mean, we political scientists, we talk more about geopolitics today. Over the last 10 or 20 years, geopolitics more important for us to analyze. I'm not saying geopolitics newly emerged, but why geopolitics and what is geopolitics, right? And textbook definition of geopolitics is geopolitics emphasizes protecting national borders. Well, is it a good definition? Geopolitics emphasizes protecting national borders. Itself, I mean, geopolitics is a combination of two words, geography, politics. It's a combination. In other words, geopolitics is a unique type of research that looks into how geography meets politics. That's geopolitics. Yeah, right. In other words, some countries are poorer than others, okay? And some countries are more hostile than others, like the Soviet Union or today's Russia. Why they always pose like challenges to the Western countries or African countries, why they keep like lagging behind the Western countries. It's because of geography. If you take that kind of attitude, that's geopolitics, right? Because Russia is always much more like I mean, don't misunderstand me. I mean, Russia is always more or less like aggressive. Aggressive and challenging. Because Russia's geography, Russia's location, is designed to make Russia behave like that. That's geopolitics. If you take that kind of attitude, that's geopolitical attitude. Because Russia is located in a place where a lot of raw materials are, right, deposited underground. And no manufacturing base, technologically very deficient. Right? Russia is like that geographically. Right? So that politically Russia behave always like the way they behave today. That's geopolitics. So this kind of inquiry is becoming more and more common today in the post-Cold War era. So geopolitics coming back, and conventional and weapons type of studies becoming less and less important. Becoming less and less important. And globalization has generated a lot of security problems. Right? Financial globalization has generated a lot of problems. And number 4, I think in studying security issues, the things that I just mentioned, like a geography or, weapons versus other factors, traditional or non-traditional. These are all important in studying the security structures, right? But one last thing that you must study in the security structure is balance of power. Balance of power. In other words, how different countries rise and fall, right? The Cold War structure, two superpowers, Russia, US, right? So this is the distribution of power. Then how the distribution of power is shifting today in the post-Cold War era, that's important to know in studying security. But it's interesting, this textbook, assumption behind this textbook is globalization is weakening the United States. So American power is in decline. That's how the distribution of power is shifting due to trade structure, due to financial structure, monetary structure. So these are, I think, main components of analysis. Then why don't we look at different periods of the security structure. So the post-Cold War security structure, the main characteristics I have just mentioned is repeated here. The Cold War, right? 47, 1990, this is Cold War security structure. Cold War security structure mostly understood in terms of national defense, weapons, traditional security issues, but relatively stable. The reason for that stability, bipolarity. Distribution of power is important in explaining stability of the Cold War structure. Then the Soviet Union collapsed and the new system begins. Post-Cold War security structure begins. Post-Cold War security structure, 2 periods. Number 1 period, 1991-2000. We need to provide details of this for each period. We are going to do that, right? Then how do we distinguish these different periods? Like I said, non-traditional security structure, non-traditional security issues, right? then balance of power, right? So based on these things, we need to distinguish different periods. Like I said, violence, civil war, ethnic conflicts, these define post-Cold War security structure. And terrorism replaced nuclear war, right? Nuclear weapons no longer the main thing countries are struggling for, right? So non-traditional security issues, more important, rather than traditional security issues. Balance of power is shifting. Okay, so you need to consider these factors in defining post-Cold War period 1 and post-Cold War period 2, which is 2001, 2008. Then now, the current stage, we are still in the post-Cold War stage. Right? We need to define the current stage as opposed to post-Cold War period 1, then post-Cold War period 2. Then maybe we are in the 3, post-Cold War 3. Right? It's important to make a distinction between, so post-Cold War 1, 2, 3. It's important to distinguish different periods. Let's talk a little bit about the Cold War security structure first. Right? What defines the Cold War security structure? Main thing, conflict, tension between the US and the Soviet Union. Lasted for about 5 decades. Right? US-Soviet conflict lasted for 5 decades. That is the Cold War. That is the Cold War. They have never used nuclear weapons. That's why it's called the Cold War. It's not hot war. Right? It was still cold, not hot. Because nuclear weapons prohibited them from using, resorting to extreme measures. Right? Because that's the nature of nuclear weapons. So because of nuclear weapons, maybe stability was maintained. Right? The cold status, the cold state was maintained. Right? It was bipolar structure. This is how power was distributed, bipolar. 2 big powers, then remaining smaller powers. Another thing that defined the Cold War security structure was ideology. Right? Ideology. It was about conflicts over weapons, nuclear weapons, but at the same time was conflict over ideology, like a democracy versus communism, or market versus communism, state plan economy. Ideology was about nuclear weapons. Who has more weapons? That really mattered at that time. Right? This is important thing to add. This is important thing to add. In principle, the Cold War security structure was a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. But we need to add China in the bipolar structure. Okay? China, it's not yet like a tripolar relations, but the role of China in defining US-Russian relations was very important. It was very important. The US was able to confront the USSR because China-Russia relations were bad. That's why China is important. So throughout the Cold War, China-Russia having conflictual relations. throughout the Cold War. That's important. That's how America was confronting the USSR. So China-Russia conflicts, that's defining characteristic of the Cold War. Europe, Japan divided, weak. The European continent after World War II, it's weakened, divided, right? It's not coherent polity. It's weakened, divided. Particularly Germany is divided, right? Japan divided, dismembered. So both Japan, Europe, very weak. China was weak. Europe, Japan was weak. That's why US Soviet was bipolar, right? This will change later. This shows how power was distributed. Now, how the Cold War ended, it's important to know, right? How the Cold War was declining. First, I think both powers, the Cold War ended because America was weakening and the Soviet Union was weakening. America first was weakening due to the Vietnamese War in the 70s. In the 60s, the Vietnamese War, America was weakened. And like I said, we studied the financial structure. When we studied financial structure, America was weakening because of the weakening dollar in the 1970s, early 1970s. So both in terms of financial and these military reasons, America was weakening already in the early 1970s. Because America was weakening, US and the Soviet Union, they began to reconcile each other. That's détente. Détente, right? Reconciliation in the 70s, right? Détente in the 70s, right? This shows America was weakening. So America was extending hands to the Soviet Union, right? Why don't we, have a pause, right? That's 70s. Now, another shift after 70s. In the meantime, Europe, Japan was recovering. Europe, Japan rising, right? Both America and the Soviet Union, weakening. Europe, Japan was rising instead. The USSR made a big mistake in invading Afghanistan, 1979. Right? This is another sort of a critical point after which the Soviet Union goes into the stage of a collapse. America is repeating this in the 2000s. Right? Why Afghanistan? Right? For both countries, we need to discuss that. Why Afghanistan is so important for both superpowers. The new Cold War. The new Cold War began. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. And it's the beginning of the weakening of the Soviet Union. Then Reagan administration comes around. Then Reagan administration sort of reimposes a bipolar structure. In other words, America began to rise again. Okay? And sort of modernizing nuclear weapons. Okay? So détente stopped. Détente period stopped after the Reagan administration. And arms control talks stop. Okay? Nuclear race begins, arms control talks stop. That's why it's called the New Cold War, 80 and 89. Look at this. We have a new factor here. 1984, it's important why the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States finally emerged as a winner after this new Cold War. Number one, nuclear race and arms control strategy, winning strategy over arms control issues. But more importantly, energy issues, oil price issues favored U.S. strategy. Oil price collapsed, 1984. Oil price collapsed. So important issue, so important factor behind the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why oil price collapsed? The U.S. conjunction with Saudi Arabia, okay, they dumped a lot of oil into the market. Overnight, the price collapsed. Then what happens to Russia, the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, a lot of money comes from oil exports, right? So the Soviet government began to face financial problems because of this, right? Then Gorbachev, came out, right, announcing some peace proposals, right? Then, the multinational empire began to break up, despite these, Gorbachev peace proposals. A lot of social problems, economic mismanagement, but ethnic conflicts within the Soviet multinational empire and the Soviet economic mismanagement and social malaise, all these problems, I think ultimately broke up the Soviet Union. But without this, we can't explain the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is most important, damning like a blow to the Soviet Union. So without this, Soviet collapse is not explained, cannot be explained. So important factor. Currently we are seeing the energy crisis. I mean, the similar type of, like a confrontation between Russia and the West over energy prices, Ukrainian crisis, and all that. And it seems like we are repeating some of the scenarios we are having at that time, right? America is now debating again, then how to break up Russian monopoly over European gas market, right? And several ways. There's several ways. Ukraine is pivotal place. And 70% of Russian exports transit through Ukraine. Very important. And Europe strategically dependent on Russian exports, gas exports. 30% for Russian gas, 35% for Russian oil, right? And European shale gas is not prospective yet at the moment, right? So indigenous production, very limited. And U.S. shale exports, LNG exports, are not expected until 2016, which means Europe has to rely on Russian gas and oil exports at least until 2016, right? For several more years, Europe will be dependent on Russian exports. So this defines Russian U.S. or Russian Western, Russian European confrontation today, right? America has some strategies. Okay, America has some strategies. I think U.S. LNG exports is one of those strategies. U.S. LNG exports, proposed LNG exports, potential LNG exports, I think will make a huge contribution to to the breakup of this Russian monopoly, Russian influence. Russian influence and Russian oil exports income will be reduced dramatically, right? But the problem is The problem is 50% of Russian revenue comes from energy exports. Okay, 50%. That's how Russia is vulnerable to external shocks. Right? I think Russia must reform this highly raw material based economy. Right? Otherwise, their economy is not bright over the long term. So they must reform the economy. But second thing, I think that 50% for energy exports. But if you look inside the export structure, only 30% from gas exports. Only 30%. I mean, I'm talking about money, revenues. 30% Russian income comes from gas exports. 70% oil exports. What does that mean? What does that mean? The current conflicts are over gas issues, right? Gas issues. If America blocks Russian gas exports to the European continent, then Russia can sell oil, right? And sort of secure a lot of money by exporting oil. Then when America blocks gas exports, they can still keep Gazprom and these the Russian style of a system. They keep that still afloat. Russia can survive, even if America blocks gas exports. So, like Reagan did, 1984, the final blow the U.S. can deal to Russia today is to change oil price. This is a repetition of what happened in 1984. So, oil price collapsed, 1984, leading to the collapse of Soviet Union, and neoliberal policy was implemented in developing countries. That's what we saw in previous chapters. And Soviet Union collapsed, broke up, and the Cold War system ended, together with the collapse of Soviet Union. Cold War system ends. Then completely new system emerges after 1980. Oh, one more thing. The Soviet Union gone, okay? Soviet Union gone, then the US is unilaterally powerful now, okay? Unilaterally powerful. But one more factor here, which is China, right? China approaches Russia. Then China and Russia become friends. Later, this will become a big factor in affecting US power. Right? China-Russia rapprochement. That happened during this period. Right? Now, next. Post-Cold War I. What happened during this period? You all know this, right? Very confusing, right? A lot of things that defy explanation, conceptual explanations. Lots of things happen, right? But nobody knew what's going on in international affairs, right? After the Cold War. So confusing. Everything justifies our conventional understanding because the issues were non-traditional. All these issues are simply non-traditional, something that we never experienced, we never expected, right? So that's why it's called non-traditional. It's not traditional issues. I think the chapter gives a very good explanation of what happened in these years, post-Cold War I period. U.S. president at that time was, most of the 1990s, President Clinton. President Clinton. How do we define the decade of the 90s? The Soviet Union collapsed. The U.S. remains, solely remains, but not yet unilateral security structure. Not yet unilateral structure. It's a multilateral structure. Right? So after bipolarity, multipolarity sets in this decade. That's how Clinton defined multilateral decade. Although the moment was unilateral, right? Clinton policy, Clintonian policy was like to promote multilateral cooperation. It's a big opportunity to promote US-style capitalism, market economy, and democracy. Like I said, Russia is in shambles, right? Russia went through the 1990s. Right, it was a very difficult years for Russia in terms of political, reform, economic, ethnic. The whole country, the whole region in Russia was very chaotic. Yeah, very chaotic. Russia was losing their spirits. Russia was losing spirits, kowtowing to Western pressures. Right? They lost their pride. Russians lost their pride. Right? Probably the worst years for Russians. The Clintonian government, when they looked at the balance of power, distribution of, at that time, the 1990s, multipolar, right? Multipolar. This defines their policy. Post-Cold War II, American approach was unilateral. Okay? Post-Cold War II. But post-Cold War I, still multipolar, multilateral approach. I think the main thing in this period, after the Soviet Union gone, is, conflicts over the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Afghanistan, right? War in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Central Asia. Some conflicts in Africa, but most conflicts concentrated in these regions, like Central Asia, Middle East, Southwest Asia. And why America focused on this region, and the nature of conflict was not traditional. The nature of conflict was like a very unequal type of conflict. Like America was big power, and these are not troops, not even troops. They are just guerrilla, right? Individual guerrillas, right? Non-state organizations. So it's a highly unequal, highly like a asymmetrical type of wars. So America gets involved in this kind of a very unequal, right? Non-traditional types of wars, right? And they become terrorists. And the region was Middle East, Central Asia, Southwest. And religiously happened to be Islamic. So it's kind of Islam versus America. Because Europeans, if you look at the Europeans are divided on this. Only UK supports the US. Other European countries, they don't see eye to eye with the United States on this. So Europeans, Americans, divided on this issue. Only UK on the US side. So from today's perspective, we still have to ask questions of why particularly this region, right? Why America, zero in onto this region, and particularly this country, Iraq, right? And later Afghanistan. This is a mystery, right? It's almost like 1943 and 45 when the Soviet Union, when America began to frame the Russians at the time, Soviets, as a new enemy, 1943-44, right? It's almost like a similar to those years. So America was framing Iraqis and some Islams as new enemies in these years, post-Cold War I. And the rationale and the reason behind it, not clear. Not clear. Some argue that America caught this region, particularly this country, because of oil and gas potential in these regions. But no clear evidence that support that. And this textbook, more or less, sort of their argument is like a supportive of this kind of argument that America engaged in this, conflicts because of energy and other economic issues. And if you use more imagination, we have Americans have dollar crisis, financial crisis, and America has economic agenda, right? And you have these security challenges here. So America is juggling these two balls, right? And these two issues reinforce each other. These security threats, terrorist threats in Iraq, Afghanistan, right? And U.S. financial globalization, development policy, right? Trade policy, WTO, right? They reinforce each other. So it's not only about energy and oil and gas. It's broadly defined, right? Like a finance, trade, security, right? Complex issues. That's how this textbook explains these issues. Now, Russia, China, even closer. They become an ally in this period. Right? 1990s, peak years for Russia-China friendship. The peak years. On all areas, Russia, China, very close. Very close. Unprecedented in history, Russia-China friendship. To challenge US hegemony. Now, Central Asian energy began to emerge, right? Along with Iraqi and Afghanistan issues, Central Asian energy. These are same regions, Iraq, Middle East, Central Asia, Southwest. It's same route, the same area. Now, post-Cold War II, 2001, 2008. Post-Cold War II is a continuation of post-Cold War I, but a little bit escalation and some differences. Like we have new president, President Bush. Post-Cold War II begins with terrorist attack, 9/11, begins with this, right? Then America invades Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, Iraq already several times. Afghanistan for the first time because of this, right? Now, then America becomes unilateral. And the Bush administration, they view balance of power as more or less unilateral. And enemies are becoming clearer at the moment. Enemies becoming clearer. Not just terrorists anymore. Enemies are rogue states, according to the Bush administration. Rogue states. The Bush administration, for the first time, pinpoint to 3 enemies: Iran, Iraq, North Korea. They constitute axis of evil. These are clear enemies now. They don't. These countries are enemies because they don't adhere to the international norms. They have to be punished. It's like a Soviet Union 50 years ago. These are enemies. Although Iran, Iraq, North Korea, there was a debate at that time how North Korea is different from Iraq, right? They are all evil countries, but slightly different, right? And the way America handles them must be different. America was debating like the preemptive attack on Iran and Iraq, right? And the debate at the time, the East Asian debate, was that could America repeat the same preemptive strike on North Korea? Then what happens? Geographically, North Korea and this region quite different from the Middle Eastern region, right? This Korean peninsula is so densely populated, right? So if America sort of undertakes some preemptive strike, nuclear strike, or missile strike, then the effect here will be much more devastating, given the location here. So that's how, these enemies must be handled differently, right? And I think North Korean enemy is much more I think North Koreans are better than Iraqis, right? Smarter. Koreans are much more smarter. Kim Jong-il and his son, they look like pigs, but they're very smart pigs. Right? Their strategy, right? Saddam is gone, right? He was killed, but Kim Jong-il was okay. Even his son is okay. Right? That's how their strategy is different. And weapons of mass destruction. So this is how enemies and weapons are connected. They are enemies because they don't adhere to norms, right? These international civilian norms, they don't abide by that. But at the same time, they have these weapons of mass destruction. That's why they are more dangerous. Weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, missiles, biological, all these weapons. Right? So we need to make sure these dangerous weapons don't fall into the hands of these bad guys. Right? But like I said, US and Europeans were still divided, right? Still divided. America having a lot of problems in pushing for these, consensus, right, into the Security Council, through the Security Council. So the weapons inspection in Iraq and also in North Korea have always been a failure many times because of this, backed only by UK. Now, there are some important things here to pages 246, page 246. The last paragraph gives reasons for why America was like a so-called bogged down in Iraq. What are the reasons for the U.S. predicament in Iraq? Right, the weapons inspection was not smoothly done, and American, European, divisions. But other than that, there are other reasons for the U.S. predicament. It's important to know this, right? It's important to know this. Why America was bogged down in Iraq. The biggest reason, I think this textbook gives, the biggest reason is America didn't misunderstand the difference between terrorism and insurgency. That's the most important reason this textbook gives. Now, what is terrorism and what is insurgency? That's important to know. Terrorism, insurgency. The question is, according to this textbook and many other authors, America is failing both in Iraq and Afghanistan because America was resorting to anti-terrorist operation, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. Anti-terrorist operation, so-called ATO, right? But in fact, many guerrilla fighters in Iraq and Afghanistan, they are not quite terrorists. Many of them are simply insurgents. So U.S. prescription is wrongly applied. So America should do, to resolve this issue, to smoothly resolve this conflict, America must use counterinsurgency operations. This appears in the next page, coin operation. Counterinsurgency rather than counter-terrorist strategy. Right? Then what is counterinsurgency? Counter-terrorist is track down terrorists and, they capture them and bring them back to, right, some location, right? Sometimes they torture them, kill them. That's counter-terrorist. That's counter-terrorist. That's what Americans did. But what they capture them, those American soldiers captured are not terrorists. They are insurgents. Insurgents are insurgency. The difference between insurgency and terrorism. Insurgency is a resistance, civilian resistance to the government. Insurgency. It's a legally justified opposition to the government. That's insurgency. Right? So kind of terrorism America was using, the slogan was too broad. Too broad. They haven't distinguished between real terrorists and insurgents. That's why America was failing in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's number one. That's the biggest reason. Now, page 248. 248, second paragraph. Second paragraph, coin. Then what America should do? Coin strategy is well explained. Okay, what is coin? What is counterinsurgency? Counterinsurgency, among other things, is a policy where American soldiers or American military officers, they take into consideration religious differences. Right? Iraqis have different religions, right? And by applying terrorist methods, terrorist operations, Americans alienated many Iraqi, civilians. It's a wrong policy. So number one, all right. Good strategy is to win over hearts and minds. Like I said, hearts and minds. Counterinsurgency is a strategy to win over the hearts and minds of Iraqis or Afghans. It's not just hard power, right? Flexing muscles. It's more sophisticated strategy. That's counterinsurgency. So counterinsurgency give more attention to religious differences. And was discussing, this section discusses the local government building. Counterinsurgency is a policy where the U.S. military gives support to the building of the local government, local governance structure, right? That's counterinsurgency. Post-conflict building, according to, when you use their terms, post-conflict building. So counterinsurgency is about post-conflict building, government building. So the Bush administration was not doing a good job of engaging, Iraqis and Afghans. And the U.S. government was unilateral in many sense, so that there was a strong resistance from not terrorists but insurgents. Okay, and insurgents, they think that their struggles are justified. Their struggles are justified because they are not terrorists. They are not terrorists, right? And from their perspective, they think that they are simply liberating their country from, U.S. imperial power. So America failed to identify the nature of the threat, right? The nature of the threat. The nature of the threat is not terrorist, right? So the difference between terrorism, insurgency, America failed to make a distinction between these two. And failure to adopt an appropriate strategy. This is a very broad term. They have a much too broad conception of terrorism. and lack of a coherent nation-building plan, like I said, right, for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we have about 10 minutes left. Finally, U.S. security policy, mainly Bush administration security policy, are critiqued on several grounds. Okay, on several grounds. What are these? What are these? Critiques? Let's look at that. I think we went over this, right? Hearts and minds important, coin is important, counterinsurgency. Okay, counterinsurgency. In Iraq and Afghanistan, even Americans losing patience, right? Because the cost of managing Iraq and Afghanistan conflict was high. So even Americans were unwilling to bear the cost. Right. We need attention to religious differences. Now, then I'm talking about page 249. 249. There are 4 grounds for critiques for U.S. Security policy. Number 1, I think the Bush administration was why America was, at that time, the Bush administration was becoming unilateral. The reason, right? There are 4 reasons according to them. Number 1 reason, America was like attempting to build, the Bush administration was attempting to build kind of an empire. Empire thesis here. It's not just unilateral power. The debate in the Bush administration was whether or not America was building an empire. Right? It's not just unilateral superpower, but America was thinking of the 19th century British-style empire. The second critique of Bush administration's security policy, why America was engaging in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because of the military-industrial complex. That's second, military-industrial complex. We have, heard a lot about these. Right? America has a lot of, weapons-making companies. Right? These weapons-making companies lobby in Congress, right? So in order to make profits, they lobby for Congress, then politicians make wars here and there, right? So that they sell weapons. This is military-industrial complex thesis. And number three critique is the relationship of globalization to security issues. Here, like I said, globalization help America to push for security issues. Right? This is how trade policy, financial policy connected to security policy. Right? So Bush administration, unilateral security policy. The reason behind it is globalization, financial gains, trade gains, right? Now, finally, what is post-Cold War III, because this textbook, the last section, discusses the Obama administration, the current Obama administration. How is the post-Cold War III period, like a period from 2009, the present, is it different from the Bush period, right? Is the Obama administration different from the Bush administration? Obama's security policy, right? So that is on pages 256, 53. To understand this, to repeat again, the balance of power, the current balance of power, and Obama's policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. What is going on in Afghanistan and Iraq today, right? And Russia, China, right? We need to look at all these factors, right? Still ongoing issues. These are all ongoing issues. I think President Obama is loosening up a little bit in Iraq and Afghanistan, although we don't clearly know where Afghanistan is going today, where Iraq issues are going today. But Obama's administration is becoming a little bit more opening, right? Obama is more opening doors to issues in these regions, much more multilateral than unilateral. In terms of Russia, China, I think this is very interesting avenues for research. Russia is directly confronting the United States currently, the Crimean crisis, right? Then China, Russia, I mean, how China, Russia is moving. Are they, closing their gap, becoming closer, Russia, China, becoming closer, right? Or, I mean, is the Obama administration still viewing China as a threat, right? Is China still rising, right? How is the Crimean crisis change? How is the Crimean crisis change world politics? I think it's a pivotal moment, in my opinion. And the big difference I think Obama made in terms of security issues, the big difference is I think Obama made a big shift to the Asian region, so-called the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia. Probably because of this, Russia is sort of challenging America much more aggressively. The U.S. pivot to Asia. That is not here, but the U.S. pivot to Asia, Russian Crimean crisis, Russia-China relations, and the U.S.-Iraqi Afghan campaign, right? We need to look at all these issues, right, and to define the post-Cold War III period. Okay, these are just still temporary analysis of ongoing issues. Maybe I can, I cannot put these issues on quiz or any type of exam, but you need to keep your eyes open and see what's going on today. Now, international organizations, forget about it. Okay? International organizations, forget about it. Okay? So the remaining half, forget it. Okay? We don't cover it. Okay? Won't be on the exam. You can read it later, after this semester ends. Okay? Just forget it. So security structure, finished. Next Tuesday, knowledge and technology chapter. Okay.